Everybody, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where in the world you are connecting from. It is great to be connected with you once again in the Hacking HR interview series, which I hadn't done in a while. And yesterday I connected with an amazing guest, Stephanie Johnson, and for some reason the technology was not working well for me and for us yesterday. So hopefully today will be a better day and we are going to be able to make it work. Very happy to be together today with my friend Todd from New York City. How are you, Todd?
I am great, Enrique. How are you doing?
Good, good. It's good to have you here. And, very happy to have a fantastic conversation around leadership, communication, visuals, and a number of other things that are so fascinating. But before getting there, I want to ask you, how are you? How are you doing? How's family, in the middle of all this craziness that is going on in the world?
Yeah, crazy times. The hardest thing about this whole thing is not being able to see my mother. She lives an hour and a half from here, and we can't see each other. It's been other than through FaceTime and Zoom. So it's been 4 months since
Wow.
I've given her a hug. So that's the hardest part, is just connecting with family and friends and the physical contact. So we're all doing Zoom coffee hours and cocktail get-togethers, and but not meeting in person is tricky.
Yeah, yeah, no, it absolutely is. And I'm happy that at least we have the technology piece to be able to connect with, with those of us that we love, with our loved ones and our friends and our families, right? Imagine this happening 20 years ago.
Yeah. So, like, for example, right now, I teach leadership in the Human Capital Management graduate program at NYU, and right now we're supposed to teach in person, but we keep going back and forth between the in person and doing it remotely by Zoom. Because last semester, the class is 14 sessions. Literally at the midterm, we had 24 hours notice to shift from in person to online. So I quickly had to get up to speed on Zoom using breakout rooms and whiteboards and everything else. And the challenge is, how do you replicate the in-person experience as much as possible online? That's something we're all dealing with, whether you're at a company, you're in HR, you're teaching, whatever we do, we're all trying to make the best of a situation. And, when you teach in person, if we have to wear masks and things like that, we're cutting off facial expression and reading lips and that type of thing. And with a lot of international students, communication is very often a challenge in and of itself. So then you start wearing masks and social distancing. How do you pair up and do projects together? How do you get up at a whiteboard? So we're all trying to figure out the new reality and how do we achieve the results we need to achieve, but with the constraints of the pandemic and other things going on right now.
Yeah, it's going to be quite a challenge in everything that we know in life. It's going to be an interesting process to change the way we do things and to adapt to doing things in a new way, in a different way, right? Like you're talking about classes, is coming to work, is the process to or our relationships with friends and families and colleagues. So everything is going to change, and but that's part of the process of human growth, right? Is adapting and changing, and being able to cope with the circumstances. I once
We use
again
the word agile all the time, right? We need to be agile. We need to be flexible. We need to be. It's hard for those of us who have OCD and are literally not just over organized, but people who need to plan and strategize. It's very hard to have so many unknowns and things
yeah.
out of our control.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, once again, I want to welcome everybody who's connected on the LinkedIn Live today. Please let us know where in the world you are connecting from. We would love to know your whereabouts these days. And we are going to have a conversation about visual leadership, which is a very, very interesting concept. And Todd, why don't we kick off this conversation by defining what visual leadership means, and then we're going to take it from there, perhaps to provide some insights around how to take advantage of these concepts that you have put forward very, very strongly in your book, Visual Leadership.
Thank you, Enrique. Yeah, visual leadership, the way it's spelled, I spell, if you can see the books behind me, or I can hold it up here real quick. Visual leadership, one word with a single L. the idea behind the word, which is actually now a registered trademark, I submitted it to the U.S. Patent Office. It was rejected twice, but the third time they finally approved it. So it just shows you need to be resilient if you really believe in something, because they kept saying it was generic, visual and leadership are two words that exist, but no one combined them before into that word. So the word, one, it's a brand, right? It's the name of my book, and it's the brand. But the concept behind the word and why it's one single word with a joins shared L is that, to me, your vision as a leader, vision and leadership are inseparable from one another. How you lead is a direct result of the lens through which you see the world, right? So if you see the world in one way, you're going to lead in one way. If you see it in a different way, that's going to influence how you lead. Similarly, when we talk about leadership, we're always talking about leadership vision. What does it mean to have a vision, have a leadership vision, or to be a leadership visionary, like a Steve Jobs or a Martin Luther King Jr. or someone who sees the future, sees possibilities. So that's the idea behind visual leadership in a nutshell. It's about seeing, and no matter what we do for a living, regardless of your title, the phrase I always use is, how do you get people to see what you're saying, right? That's the metaphor of vision and looking and seeing and noticing, is how do you get an idea out of your head and into someone else's head so that they can say, oh yeah, Enrique, I see what you're saying, right? It's very hard. Like, I'm seeing all these pictures, these beautiful pictures behind you, right? If you start telling me about some of these locations, I could visualize you being there at that sunset or crossing that bridge, right? If you just tell me about it, I'm picturing it in my mind's eye, but you show me a picture and I can see exactly what you're talking about. So that's the foundation of what visual leadership's about.
Can you give us one example of maybe a leader you admire that has been perhaps at the forefront of using visual leadership in speeches, in work, in communicating a vision and whatnot? Any example that comes to mind that can be inspiring to others?
Yeah. Well, when you the very first person who came to mind is Steve Jobs, because one, he was a visionary leader. He saw possibilities. He oversaw the creation of products that didn't exist before. I mean, before him, there was no iPod, there was no iPad, there was no iPhone, right? So all of these, the Mac computer, right? Those are all visions he had in his mind. Not just him, but him and his team. But he created an environment that people could create, right? So that's probably being a leader too. It's not just your ideas, but you create a culture and a climate and environment that allows other people to see possibilities and then nurture them so that they can do that. So one of the examples of visual, if you watch, there's a book called The Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs by Carmine Gallo. He's one of the top communication and presentation gurus out there. He wrote a book and he has a series of videos on what Steve Jobs did to make him so effective. So if you just look it up on YouTube, Presentation Secrets of Steve Jobs, he spoke in pictures. He used visual language. He used imagery on his slides, very little text. He used demonstrations. He brought his ideas to life in a way that people could see it. And one of the classic examples is when he created the iPod, when he announced it, instead of holding it up and saying this little gadget holds 5 gigabytes of data, he said, what? This holds 10,000 or 5,000 songs in your pocket, or 1,000 songs in your pocket, right? We don't care how many gigs unless you're a tech geek, right? We care what this can do for us. I could carry my whole CD collection in that little thing. That's unbelievable, right? So to see possibilities is what visual leadership is all about.
That is fantastic, and I love the example of Steve Jobs, and I think it's a powerful image that everybody remembers these days, right? I think that when people think back about what Steve Jobs said, it's always a visual image. He said something. One of my favorite quotes that he said was that we don't connect the dots looking forward. We connect the dots looking backwards, right, and looking toward the past. So this is an image, right? I mean, when you imagine, I'm imagining when I was a kid, there was, these little games where you connect dots and the dots would create images and whatnot. So that's that quote is stuck in my mind, I think, because of that visual aid that he was conveying as he was sharing that idea.
Yeah, and a big part of visual leadership is using metaphor, and that's, you gave a great example of metaphor, right? As soon as you said connect the dots, I was picturing all those little coloring books we had as kids, right, where we were connecting dots and then you color things in. Connecting the dots is a metaphor that we use that means what? To create meaning out of something that doesn't have any meaning until you find it, right? So I love that. So right there, we use visual language and metaphor all the time without even realizing it. That's a great example of that.
Absolutely. We know, Todd, we know that there are 3 things that happen when leaders communicate using the advantage of visual leadership. One of them is we achieve more attention from those that we are communicating with. There's better comprehension and better retention from them as well. Can you dig a little deeper into each of these concepts? What do they mean?
Sure. What's great is that they rhyme, so they make it a little easier to remember: attention, comprehension, and retention, right? So we talk about why visuals. We can go deep into the brain science of how the brain is wired and why, as human beings, we're drawn towards visuals. Little babies are drawn to their parents' face, and they look around the world and they see and they know this and they take in things visually, right? So attention, comprehension, retention, whether you're a little baby, an infant, or you're a senior executive, right? Attention is about focus, right? If I show you something, if I show you a picture, an image, a PowerPoint slide, if I draw something for you on a board, or even if I use visual language, I'm going to get your attention. I'm going to get you to focus. I'm going to get you to think. So if I'm not using visual language, I may be checking my iPhone or I may be doing other things, but visuals get us to focus. So again, focusing, just like with our eyeglasses or whatever, that's a visual image, visual metaphor. Comprehension, when you look at something, you understand it better, right? If I am describing something to you, you're creating a picture in your own mind's eye. But if I hold up something, a map, a company's org chart, anything visual, not only do I get your attention, but now you understand what I'm talking about because you say, oh, I see what you're saying, right? So we say that all the time. And then retention, research has shown that we remember things better when they're locked into our memory than through visuals rather than just through words. So if I gave you a list of 50 words and 50 images and I asked you the next day to list them or recreate them, you're more likely to remember more of the images than you are to remember more of the words. That's scientific research that supports that. So basically, that's the concept behind attention, comprehension, and retention. And it's not just visual pictures taken through the physical eye, but visual imagery, metaphor, and storytelling taken in through. It could be taken in through the ear, but it's visual in our mind's eye.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really powerful. But now let me go perhaps close a little bit this loop and ask you, how can leaders do this, right? Because not every leader at least that I know of, I don't know if all the leaders in the world, but I know that not all leaders may have the capacity to think in images, to think in visuals. Mm-hmm. So how can they develop that muscle, if you will? How can they perhaps understand these concepts, but also put them into practice?
Sure. In the learning and development field, for years, people talked about either VAC or VARK. So that stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, and kinesthetic. So that's VARK, V-A-R-K. At one point, people thought, everyone had a different learning style, like you're more visual, you're more auditory. What they found over the years is that there's a myth of learning styles. It's not that you just have one, or we all have all four, and it depends on context, situations. In some situations, just explain it to me and I'll get it auditorily. Other situations, it would help to see something with my eyes. It's usually when you use the four in combination that it's most powerful. So I just want to put aside the fact that once people say, I'm not visual, our brains are just wired visually. It may not be your default. It may not be your preference in terms of where you go to it first. But if you're aware of this, then you can say, all right, did I show you something, tell you something, have you read something, and then have you do something? If I did all four of those things, you're more likely to engage with what I'm talking about, right? So whether you're a teacher, a manager, training someone, an HR person doing an orientation or onboarding, we could use all of these different techniques. In my book, and I talk about 4 different ways: using visual imagery, which includes drawing and pictures, using mental models and frameworks, using metaphor and analogy, and using storytelling and humor. If you get extra points if you use humor, because if people laugh, they're enjoying, they're engaged, right? Those are the 4 categories. What's interesting is the first 2 tend to be taken in through the physical eye. Mm. Visual images, pictures, drawings, and mental models. We see them with our eyes. We could draw them out. We can give you a handout or a PowerPoint slide. The last 2 are more auditory in their visuality. We'll put it that way. Auditory in their visuality. We can hear a story. We can hear you use a metaphor, and that is visual in its component. So some leaders may say, I'm really good at getting up on the whiteboard and sketching something out. Other people may say, I'm not that way. I don't draw. I can't draw, right? We could all draw. We'll get to that separately. Yeah. Other people say, I'm better with storytelling, right? visual language. So the first thing I would say to leaders is put aside the, oh, this doesn't apply to me, or I'm not a visual thinker, I'm not a visual communicator, I'm not a visual leader. We all are, and this is a skill that can be developed with the awareness. So that's the key thing behind my book, is to make people A, more aware, and B, more strategic, and then give people the tools, tips, and techniques to really do this effectively.
Yeah, that's I think that's a way, a great perhaps approach for leaders to get ideas that stick. And I know that this is something that you have been talking about for not only in the book but also in the way you share the power of visual leadership, which is how do you make these ideas stick, which is, you use the word retention before. And right now we're going through some times of crisis in the world, right? And one of the things that we know leaders need to do more than ever before is become better communicators, is become more effective communicators. And you talk about two things that I think are very powerful: storytelling and story listening.
Yeah.
And I would love for you to explain to our audience what each of those is and how can leaders become better at both of those things.
Yeah. Well, first of all, some people say, oh, I'm not a good storyteller. I'm terrible at stories. I was once doing a workshop on the art of storytelling for a group of 20 CEOs. And one of the CEOs said, oh, I'm terrible at storytelling. I hate storytelling. And I said to him, well, why do you say that? And he said, well, this is what happened to me one time. So he told this great story about how bad he was at storytelling, right? And everyone else looked at each other. It's like, that was a great story. That was so impactful, right? So a lot of times we put constraints on ourselves. I'm not a storyteller. I can't draw, right? Just eliminate those things. Maybe you're not as good as you'd like to be, but you're better than you think you are. And again, these are all skills to be developed. No one comes out born as a storyteller, right? Some people may have more charisma, more confidence, may feel more comfortable, but we could talk about it later. But I am an extreme introvert, back of the room, bookworm, behind the scenes kind of guy. A lot of B's, back of the room, bookworm, behind the scenes, right? It took me many years to speak publicly, and now I teach at NYU in Columbia. I did my first TEDx talk last year. It's all about when you practice, you get better. When you get better, you get more confident. When you get more confident, you take more risks and you put yourself out there. So it's the skill. And also, one of the things I want to clarify, we're talking a lot about leadership. We're not talking about a VP title or CEO. We're talking about everyone. Everyone is a leader. So you can define leadership as capital L. You're only a leader if you've earned that title. Mark Sanborn has a book called You Don't Need a Title to Be a Leader, which is one of my favorite little management leadership books. It's not, we know a lot of people who have leadership titles who are terrible leaders, not name your name. And then we have other people who have no title at all who create you created a whole movement around hacking HR, right? So no one gave you that title. You just took it upon yourself to do this, and it's unbelievable what you've created, right? So you're a great example of a visual leader. We could talk more about that later. How you've created this thing that we could all see the future of HR and technology and the possibilities that in a way that we never saw before until you created this movement. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
And my colleagues at NYU, like Anna Tavis and Marianne Spatola, we're all on the Enrique Rubio bandwagon of hacking HR and creating a better HR for the future, because we need to be strategic and drive changes in the world. We're not the company police. We're not the the policy enforcers. We really need to be leaders in whatever role and job title we have in HR. So those are just a few thoughts in that regard. So in fact, I think I got so far off the tangent I lost sight of the question, but all important points.
You are storytelling right now. So what you're doing is you are teaching us through the example of your own communication approach. But one thing that, of course, I want to make sure that we cover in our conversation is the idea, which you and I talked about this recently offline, and it was the idea of story listening.
Yes.
To be honest, I read a lot of material on leadership and communication and whatnot, and storytelling is in the forefront of everything, but story listening is not in the forefront of anything, right? Yeah. I mean, we know that active listening is one of the most important skills right now for the leaders of the future and for everybody else for that matter. But would you mind perhaps digging a little deeper into the concept of story listening and how to make it happen? Because it's part of creating a visual process, if you will, between the parties that are in communication.
Yeah, yeah. So that's where we started storytelling. So thank you for bringing us back on track to storytelling and story listening. One other point on storytelling, other than the fact that we're all natural storytellings, children tell stories, grandparents tell stories about the old days. We use stories all the time. If someone said to you, "How is work today?" and you say, "Oh, you wouldn't believe what happened to me today," or "A funny thing happened to me on the way to the theater," right? Any of those phrases, you're telling a story. So I think that's the key thing. It's communicating. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. There's character. You are the lead. You are the protagonist of your own life story, right? So we are all involved in stories, and everything is a story if we start looking at it through that lens, to use a visual metaphor. Story listening, one of the key responsibilities of leaders is to be better listeners. One of the things I found, we do a lot of 360 evaluations. One of the things that we find is that leaders, listening is the category that leaders score themselves the highest in, that their people score them the lowest in. So that's the area where there's the biggest gap. I say the biggest gap is between the ears, right? So leaders need to do less talking and more listening. There's that phrase, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that should be the ratio of talking to listening. Leadership story listening is about not only hearing, but pulling out the stories from other people. Tell me about it. So we do that with behavioral interviewing, right? Tell me about a time when you faced a similar situation. Tell me about a time when you had a situation with your boss that put you in an awkward situation or something like that, right? To pull stories out of people is to listen and to learn. And one of the quotes I use in my class, John F. Kennedy said that leadership and learning are indispensable to one another. And we learn through listening, right? We learn through hearing people's stories and experiences. If you're a CEO in the ivory tower and you're far detached from what's happening with your people on the front lines as well as your customers, you're making decisions in a vacuum, right? You're not hearing what's going on out there in the field, out there in the world. So that's why story listening is so important. And it's listening not only to hear, but to feel. Listening with empathy and compassion. And we could talk more about this, but one of the concepts I've been talking more about, if you look at the cover of my book, you have this big rainbow eye, right? Originally, I had a blue eye because my company is called Big Blue Gumball, so I figured there'd be some consistency with Big Blue Gumball. But then what I realized, and actually I didn't just realize it myself through the feedback I got, was to have a blue eye, even though it was innocent and even though there was no agenda, it was not discriminatory, but it was exclusionary, right? So to go with the rainbow eye represents, no one has an eye that looks like this. So there's no one person in the world I've ever met who has that eye, right? The rainbow eye represents diversity and inclusion in all its forms, and the colorfulness of it represents innovation and creativity, right? That's the idea behind the rainbow eye. The concept I've been talking a lot about now is flipping the eye, right? A lot of times we talk about our leadership vision. How do we make our vision come true? But this is how it relates to the story listening. How do we look at the world through the lens of others? How do we put ourselves in the shoes of people who are different from us? Whether that's people going through a different situation with the coronavirus, whether it's Black Lives Matter, whether it's the economic crisis. As a leader, we need to see things through the lens and the experience of others, to put on their shoes, walk around in them, as they talk about in To Kill a Mockingbird, right? So that's basically some of the concepts. Is flipping the eye is to look at yourself in the mirror, look internally at your own belief systems, what you believe, how you lead, and why you do what you do. And secondly, can you look at the world through the lens of others to be a more empathetic and compassionate visionary leader?
That's the hope that I think we all have about our leaders, right? That they can become that kind of leaders, those kind of leaders who communicate well, but more importantly, that they have the capacity to listen to others, their stories, and get their stories and do so with empathy and caring and understanding. Yeah. This has been fascinating, Todd. And as we wrap up our conversation, I would love to ask you what would be a playbook, if you will, a top 1, 2, 3 very, very concrete actions that leaders and everybody else, for that matter, not only those who hold the title of a leader, but everybody else, what would be a to-do list for them to strengthen these muscles of visual leadership and utilize it properly in life and in the workplace?
Yeah. So since you asked for 3, I'm going to talk about visual thinking, visual communication, and visual leadership. So first, visual thinking. Start thinking in pictures. Start to use look at the world through the lens of almost like you're watching a movie or looking through a photo album, right? Start to see things and notice things that you haven't noticed before. So like if you're walking down the street, not that we're walking down streets these days, right? If you're walking down the streets of New York, but because we're all hunkering at home, but now that we're starting to come out a little bit, start to look around and notice things and people that you haven't noticed before. So look at things from different perspectives. So that's the thinking part. Visual communication, can you communicate more visually? Can you use more stories? Can you use metaphors and analogies that resonate with the other person? So that's a big part of visual communication, is you need to speak the language of your listener. So if you're an HR person, can you speak the language of finance? Can you speak the language of marketing? Can you speak the language of technology? Because if we just talk in HR jargon, we're just going to alienate people. If you say we need funding for a new HRIS, if people don't know what that stands for, they're not giving you any money, right? You need to come up with a story and a metaphor so that the people who write the checks are going to say, oh, I understand, I see what you're saying, and sure, let's do it, right? So that's the visual communication part. We need to get others, so we need to see what others are saying, but we also need to get others to see what we're saying. And the visual leadership part is to say, all right, I need to manage and lead, and I need to think and communicate more visually. How can I do that? How can I blend the two together, almost like a Venn diagram? And by leading more visually, you can help people see possibilities and change the world in a way that without using visual leadership, maybe it wouldn't have happened. So that's what I would say. It's just this is a new tool in your toolkit. So if you watch my TEDx talk on the power of visual thinking or read my book, it's just a start. There's a lot out there, but I think that's the key thing, is this movement towards design thinking and experiential learning and also visual thinking. And that's how we could see the world in a new light and make it a different and a better place for more people.
Absolutely. Love the idea. Visual thinking, visual communication, visual leadership. And it's all about thinking, communicating, managing, and leading, utilizing the power of visuals to increase, of course, as we said before, attention, comprehension, retention. And to be able to do this, you have to make sure that you have the skills of storytelling, but more importantly, story listening. Yes. And when it comes to story listening, you must be an empathetic leader who is able to truly understand and with empathy what you are listening from the stories of your teams, of your audience, and whatnot. So Todd, I think I got some great ideas in here, and I think our audience did as well. So thank you so much for being with me today and sharing all this amazing content.
Thank you, Enrique. Luckily, we both talked fast. So we packed about 2 hours worth of content into a half hour. So this was great.
We did. Imagine if we were doing all this just in visuals. It would be like, image after image, never ending. Well, thank you so much, Todd. It was great to have you with me today. And
my pleasure.
Everybody, thank you so much for staying connected to this LinkedIn Live Hacking HR interview as part of our Hacking HR interview series. And I hope you continue to join all the stuff that we're doing, programs and interviews, the podcast that we're going to be releasing soon. Todd is in one of our podcasts, and just continue to be engaged. So thank you, everybody. Stay safe. I'll see you soon. Thank you, Todd.